What failure really is. Almost everyone carries a memory of a failure that still stings. A business that closed, a relationship that ended badly, a goal abandoned halfway through. These moments feel permanent, as if they define who we are, but failure is really just an event, information about what didn't work under specific conditions, not a verdict on your worth or potential. This book won't pretend failure doesn't hurt, but it offers a way to hold that pain alongside a broader truth. People who build meaningful lives aren't the ones who never fail, but the ones who have learned to feel the disappointment, extract what's useful, protect their sense of self-worth from any single outcome, and keep moving, often in a slightly adjusted direction. Failure often feels disproportionately painful because humans are deeply social. For most of history, being seen as incompetent carried real survival consequences, and our brains still react to failure, especially witnessed failure, as a kind of threat. The pain is also sharper when there's a big gap between expectation and reality, which is why people with rigid, high expectations tend to feel failure more intensely. It's sharpest of all when a goal is tied to identity. I am a successful person. Since failing then feels like a contradiction of who you are, not just an external setback. Much of this pain also resembles grief, the loss of time, effort, and an imagined future, and deserves the same patience grief usually gets. Fear of failure often operates invisibly, long before anything goes wrong, showing up as, "I'll wait until I'm ready," rather than as a conscious fear. It commonly produces safe mediocrity, choosing low-risk options even when riskier ones offer far greater reward, slowly accumulating unexplored potential and quiet regret. This happens partly because vivid, imaginable failures, embarrassment, loss, loom larger than abstract costs like never trying. Fear loosens its grip through direct experience, discovering a failure was survivable, and through examining it concretely. What exactly am I afraid will happen? How likely is it? What would I do if it did? Numbing the fear specifically usually shrinks it. The most useful shift after a failure is changing the question from, "What does this say about me?" which leads to shame and paralysis, to "What does this tell me about the approach, and what should change?" The second question produces specific, actionable answers, like underestimated timelines or missing support, rather than sweeping self-judgments. This reframe works best with a little time and distance, since immediate emotion makes lessons hard to hear clearly and forced positivity can feel hollow. It also doesn't mean avoiding accountability. Most failures involve a mix of controllable and uncontrollable factors, and an honest, accurate accounting of both is more useful than either inflating or minimizing your own role. "I failed at this" describes an event. "I'm a failure" describes an identity, and the second rarely holds up to scrutiny no matter how true it feels in the moment. Language tends to slide from one to the other. "I failed the exam" becomes, "I'm not smart," adding layers of generalization the original event doesn't support. A useful practice is noticing this slide and translating back to the specific, accurate version. This distinction has real consequences. If a setback is seen as proof of a fixed trait, trying again feels pointless. If it's seen as an event with adjustable causes like preparation or strategy, trying again with adjustments makes sense. The same setback, framed differently, can lead to giving up or to a better next attempt. Failure rarely brings one clean emotion. More often it's a tangle of grief, shame, and anger, and skipping past them tends to push them underground rather than resolve them. Grief, the loss of something that mattered, deserves time and space, even if it doesn't move in a straight line. Shame thrives in secrecy and often loosens once spoken to a trusted person who responds with understanding rather than judgment. Anger can contain useful information about what felt unfair, but needs a legitimate outlet: writing, talking, physical activity, or it tends to leak out unhelpfully or curdle into resentment. Giving yourself a bounded period to simply feel these things before moving to analysis tends to make the whole process cleaner. Once the initial intensity eases, A structured look back, a post-mortem, turns failure into a learning opportunity. Start with a plain, chronological account of what happened, separate from interpretation, since memory tends to distort after the fact. Then sort contributing factors into what was controllable and you change, controllable but reasonable at the time, and genuinely outside your control. Most failures involve a mix, and an honest split avoids both excessive self-blame and learned helplessness. Also look for what went right, since few efforts fail in every respect. Finish with a small number of specific, concrete adjustments, not vague resolutions like try harder, but things like build in more time or test the idea on a smaller scale first. Resilience isn't being unaffected by failure. It's absorbing a setback, processing it, and continuing, often in an adjusted direction, carrying forward what was learned. A key factor is mindset. If abilities are seen as fixed, failure feels like proof you don't have it, discouraging further effort. If abilities are seen as developable, failure just shows where you currently are, supporting continued effort. Most people hold a growth mindset in some areas and a fixed one in others, and it's worth noticing which areas make failure feel most identity-threatening. Resilience is built through surviving past setbacks, having support systems, keeping goals flexible enough that one failed approach doesn't end the whole pursuit, and sometimes through a genuine, reflective choice to redirect rather than persist. A significant failure can shake confidence well beyond the area it occurred in, introducing background doubt about your own judgment. Reassurance alone rarely fixes this. What helps more is rebuilding evidence through small, low-stakes actions that show your judgment, while fallible, generally works and can be adjusted when it doesn't. It also helps to shift confidence from being outcome-based, things will work out, which is fragile, to process-based, I know how to handle things whether or not they work out, which is durable. Recovery takes time, often more than feels comfortable, and treating the pace of recovery itself as another test tends to slow things down rather than speed them up. Relationship failures involve untangling not just your own role, but how your actions affected someone else. A common trap is overclaiming or underclaiming responsibility. Most difficulties involve patterns both people contributed to, even if unequally. When it comes to repair, acknowledging impact, I see how that affected you, and I'm sorry, tends to matter more than explaining intent. Not every relationship failure should be repaired by restoring what existed before. Sometimes ending was the right outcome, and the more useful repair is making sure the experience doesn't become an unconscious template, whether through becoming overly guarded or repeating the same dynamics in future relationships. These failures often happen publicly, adding an extra layer of exposure. In business, failure is often treated as an expected cost of doing things, true, but that framing can minimize real losses that still deserve to be processed. Creative failure can feel especially personal, since the work feels like an extension of the self. Separating something I made from who I am is one of the hardest and most important skills for sustained creative work. Career setbacks involve a mix of systemic factors and personal choices, and untangling the two matters. Blaming yourself entirely for a layoff driven by broader conditions, or blaming circumstances entirely for a recurring pattern, both lead to the wrong lessons. In all three areas, it helps to separate evaluating one attempt from evaluating the broader direction. Persistence isn't automatically virtuous, and pivoting isn't automatically giving up. What matters is the expected value of continuing from here, not what's already been invested, the sunk cost trap. At the same time, abandoning things at the first setback means never finding out if persistence would pay off. Useful questions. Has the core idea actually been tested, or did this fail for unrelated reasons? Is there a specific adjustment that addresses what went wrong, or would continuing just repeat the same approach? What would need to be true for this to be worth continuing, and is there real reason to believe it could become true? Pivoting and persisting both usually involve adjustment, The real choice is often what specifically to change, not an all-or-nothing decision. How well someone handles failure is largely decided beforehand, through habits and structures built during calmer times. Financial and emotional buffers, savings, and sources of identity beyond a single domain mean one setback doesn't cascade into crisis and allow clearer decisions made from "I'll be okay" rather than desperation. Regular check-ins and feedback loops catch problems while they're still small, since many big failures are really small, unaddressed signals that grew. Relationships that offer honest outside perspective help counter the distorted view that comes from being too close to a situation. And reflection habits practiced on small, everyday setbacks, not just major ones, make the post-mortem process familiar rather than overwhelming when it's really needed. Self-compassion isn't an excuse for repeating mistakes. Research suggests the opposite. People who treat themselves with reasonable kindness after failure tend to take more responsibility and try again more often than those who respond with harsh self-criticism. Harsh self-talk triggers defensiveness, denial, or shutdown, none of which support honest reflection. Compassion, recognizing failure as common to everyone, acknowledging pain without being consumed by it, and responding with warmth rather than harshness, creates the safety needed for that reflection to happen. A simple check. Notice the tone you use with yourself after a setback, and ask whether you'd ever speak to a friend that way. Self-compassion doesn't replace analysis. It makes honest analysis possible. A failure that feels catastrophic now often looks different years later, sometimes still painful, but often also recognizable as a turning point. This is hard to feel in the moment partly because of the end of history illusion. The sense that who we are and what matters to us right now is more or less final, when in reality both tend to keep shifting, often because of experiences like this one. This isn't a reason to force every failure into a redemption story. Some genuinely remain losses, but it's worth holding alongside the pain a quiet awareness that current intensity isn't a reliable guide to how this will look later. It also helps to remember that most visible, successful paths are made of many invisible failed attempts. The smooth path others appear to have walked usually wasn't. When supporting someone through failure, the common instinct, jumping to solutions, advice, or silver linings, often lands as dismissive of their actual feelings. Early on, acknowledgement, "that sounds really hard," usually helps more than advice, which is better received once the initial intensity has settled, and ideally offered by invitation rather than assumption. Comparisons, to your own experience or to people who have had it worse, can unintentionally shift focus away from the person or minimize their pain. Pain isn't a competition. One of the most valuable things you can offer is consistent presence over time, checking in weeks or months later, after the initial flurry of support has faded but the person may still be working through it. Perfectionism differs from high standards. Someone with high standards can recognize partial progress, while perfectionism treats anything short of the target as equivalent to total failure. This shows up in absolute language, always, never, a complete disaster, which erases useful detail about what actually worked and what didn't. It also creates paralysis around starting, since starting risks the gap between an imagined perfect result and a messy real one, ironically producing less output overall. A practical fix is framing early attempts explicitly as drafts or version 1, and setting goals as ranges or minimums rather than fixed pass-fail targets, without lowering genuine standards for what good eventually looks like. When a similar failure recurs across different situations, relationships, jobs, projects, the useful question shifts from "what happened this time" to "what about how I approach this keeps producing this result?" This can feel like proof of being fundamentally flawed, but a pattern reflects a habit, not a fixed trait, and habits can change. Patterns are often easier for others to spot than for the person living them, since any single instance can be explained away by its own circumstances. Once identified, the useful focus is specific moments, what triggers the pattern, and what different response could be tried right there, rather than broad, "Why do I keep doing this?" questions. Breaking a pattern is gradual and includes its own smaller setbacks along the way, which are part of the process, not evidence it isn't working. A few tools used in combination form a workable process. First, name what happened in plain factual terms, separate from interpretation. Second, let the emotional response exist without immediately demanding a lesson from it. Third, run a post-mortem. Sort controllable from uncontrollable factors, note what worked too, and land on a few specific adjustments. Fourth, watch for language drifting from event, "this didn't work," to identity, "I can't do this," and translate back. Fifth, use the persistence or pivot reflection. Has the core idea been tested? And is there a specific adjustment worth trying? Sixth, periodically revisit past setbacks with distance to notice how their significance has shifted, building a sense that current intensity isn't the final word. If outcomes aren't guaranteed, what's the point of trying? One common but incomplete answer treats effort purely as an investment in a future outcome, making a failed effort feel entirely wasted. A more accurate view separates the value of an effort from its outcome. Years spent on something that ultimately didn't work still produced learning, skills, relationships, and experience that don't disappear simply because the headline goal wasn't met. Meaning often comes less from outcomes than from having engaged seriously, grown, connected with others, and contributed something. Sources available regardless of how things turn out. This doesn't erase the real loss of a failed outcome, but it changes the overall accounting and makes it more possible to keep engaging with things that matter, knowing not all of them will succeed. The thread running through this book is simple. Failure is something that happens, not something you are, and what happens afterward matters far more than the failure itself. None of this makes failure painless, nor should it. The goal isn't to reach a point where failure no longer happens or no longer hurts, since it's a recurring part of doing anything that matters. What changes is what comes after the pain, whether it becomes the end of the story or one chapter within a much longer one that includes what was learned, adjusted, and tried next. If you're currently in the aftermath of something that didn't go as hoped, both things can be true at once, that it genuinely hurts and that it doesn't define what comes next. That next chapter hasn't been written yet.